This is my Triumph bobber. And this is my Baja bug. This has carburetors. And this has fuel injection, even though it's made to look like a carburetor. So which one's best? And why is it important to understand how a carburetor works to tune EFI? Well, stay tuned and I'll show you. So why are carbs so important? And are carburetors better than EFI? Well, watch this video and you'll have a much better understanding of how carburetors work, how fuel injection works, and you can decide for yourself. I believe that understanding how carburetors work really helps with the fundamentals of tuning EFI. And so does Steve Morris.
This, because I'll tell you what, understanding this helps you understand EFI. Everything applies.
Whether it's a carburetor or fuel injection, they both have the same job, and that is to supply the engine with the right amount of atomised fuel for the air which is being drawn in. Tuning with EFI, people are looking at computer screens and gauges and stuff. Some people do get off their asses and read spark plugs. What's actually going on is a real physical thing. It's a real physical engine mixing physical fuel and air together. With carburetors, it's a mechanical, physical thing. It's actually mixing the fuel and air together. You're working with the part that does it. I believe working with carburetors, you get a great understanding of what's actually going on in the inlet manifold and combustion chamber. Don't get me wrong, I love EFI. It's infinitely tunable, but that's the beauty of carburetors. They use the laws of physics to keep the tune spot on. However, carburetors do get warm, because they are a physical thing. Mind you, saying that, so do injectors, and that's a real pain when they do that. So let's get into what the engine needs, when it needs it, and how carburetors and fuel injection do this. So, the very basis of it all is an engine needs a certain amount of fuel and air for an efficient combustion. With normal pump gas you get from the Bowser, that ratio is generally about 14.7 parts of air to 1 part of fuel. This is called the stoichiometric ratio. This is not exactly spot on for all applications and all engines, but we won't get into the details. This is just a rough figure for now. This also changes with different fuel as well, and gets really interesting when you start getting into methanol and nitromethane. But that's for another time maybe, and it's a vast subject to cover. But let me know if you want to see that covered, and I'll make a video about it. Right, this guy here, the carburetor. Its job is to get the right amount of fuel squirted into the air which is passing through it. So every 14.7 parts of air going through it, it's going to squirt 1 part of fuel in basically. So how does it do this? Well, when you put your foot on the accelerator, it opens the throttle valve, which is just like a throttle valve on fuel injection, and air passes through the barrel. And the air passing through the barrel actually draws the fuel out. I'll show you how it does that, or I'll try to. This is a very simplified version of the carburetor at its very basic form. I'm trying to keep it basic as I can at the moment because it is a basic principle really. This is the barrel of the carburetor. This is your throttle valve. So when the throttle valve opens, it allows air to be drawn through the carburetor because the engine's drawing it in. It's sucking it through the barrel of the carburetor. And this bit here is called a venturi. It's a narrower part of the barrel. And the air movement going through the venturi causes a low pressure underneath it. and it will draw fuel, this is fuel here by the way, out of the float bowl. I'll get to that in a minute, what a float bowl is. And it draws it up here and down into the engine. I'll show you how that works actually. Right, so that is the fuel in the fuel bowl. This is the jet, and if I blow air across the top of the jet, the speed of the air will cause low pressure and suck the fuel out, like this. This is why carburetors are so good at getting the right amount of fuel into the air, because the amount of fuel going into the air is governed by the amount of air going through there. It's simple. And with regards to tuning the amount of fuel that goes in there, you have different sized jets to allow different amounts of fuel to go through. It's quite a bit more complicated than this here, but we'll get into that later. So, to have fuel in the float bowl is, it's very hard to see on this sort of carburetor, but it is in the middle there. The fuel actually goes into the fuel pipe and into the float bowl, and it's actually got a float in it, just like the stopcock on a toilet. That's how that works. So this is your float bowl, and you've got your fuel pipe coming out of it like that, connected to your fuel pump or whatever. That's a fuel pump. Yeah, so that's your fuel supply, and your fuel is being pushed into the float bowl there. But what's stopping the fuel pressure from the fuel pump pushing the fuel all the way through and out here? Well, what there is there's a little needle valve here. Drawn that the wrong way around. Let's do this again. Let's start a new piece of paper. So what stops it blowing it all the way through? Well, you've got a needle valve here, which is joined to a float, which is on like a pivot or whatever. So when the fuel level drops, it actually opens that valve there and lets more fuel through. And then when the level rises, it shuts the fuel off. Just like a stopcock on a toilet. These pictures are getting worse. So, the other point to note is that the level of the fuel needs to actually be below this jet here. Otherwise, it's just going to, gravity is just going to make it come out. I think what happens is this float bowl on my picture's in the wrong place, but I think it'll be up a bit higher so that the float level is about there. Hope you understand how the float bowl works on a carburetor. I'll actually show you one now. This is a very old and tired and badly corroded carburetor. So inside the carburetor, that's your float bowl there. That's where all the fuel sits, and it gets drawn out through a jet down the bottom and then into the venturis there. That's your fuel pipe in there, and that little bit there is your needle valve. So when the fuel level rises in the float bowl there, it shuts the fuel off. The other thing a carburetor has is it has a choke, and the reason for this is when the engine's cold, it needs way more fueling, and with injection this is all done with the map and a signal from the coolant temperature sensor. But on a old school car, this is all done mechanically. What you have is you've got your throttle valve down the bottom there as normal, and you have another valve very similar to it at the top here. And what happens is when the engine's cold, this flap closes, so the vacuum of the engine is unable to draw so much air through. So instead, it sucks fuel out from the fuel system and makes it even richer. That's a very basic explanation of how the choke works. And this carburetor here is a Weber carburetor. It doesn't have a choke flap like that. It does it another way with this little lever here. It actually has variable jets in here which let a lot more fuel in. So with EFI, this is all done with the map, and it's all computer controlled, getting a signal from the coolant temperature sensor as to how warm or hot the engine is, and adjust the fuel accordingly. But with something like this, you have a cable in the dash to pull the choke on and off. Or you can have like something like a bimetallic strip which heats up with the engine heat and actually opens this flap up again. So how does fuel injection do all this? Well, that little guy there, the fuel injector, it just squirts fuel directly into the inlet port or directly into the combustion chamber, whatever sort of system you've got. And it's all controlled by a computer map. And that gets its information of how much air is being fed to the engine from various sensors on the engine, which I'm not going to get into now because this video is not about how fuel injection works. This is more about how carburetors work and how important understanding them is to tune in EFI. As I said before, EFI is infinitely tunable because you can tune all these little different areas of rev ranges and throttle position on the map. And you can't really do that with a carburetor. Once it's jetted, it's a set it and forget it. Back in the day, there was mechanical fuel injection, which worked really well. The injector, instead of pulsing like it does on modern injectors with a solenoid or piezo crystal, it had a constant flow. And there was a metering device which measured the amount of air being drawn in by the engine, and it would adjust the fuel pressure to the injector accordingly. It worked really well, actually. It was pretty good and very reliable. Whether it's fuel injection or carburetor, the engine still needs the same fuel at the same time regardless to do whatever the engine needs to do. So this is why I think it's important to understand how this guy here works, because this has to supply the engine with the fuel under the same conditions that the fuel injector does. When I say conditions, I mean idling, cold start on choke like we just covered. There's also something which is very important, and with fuel injection it's called tipping or accelerator enrichment, and that's actually also done on a carburetor, which is physically by a little extra pump here which is called the accelerator pump. So when you open the throttle, it pushes that pump in and physically squirts fuel into the barrel, so that when you first open the throttle you don't just get a gob full of air with no fuel. That's the idea of that. Holley carburetors do this a little bit different. Instead of having like a diaphragm pump, they have I think it's called a power control valve, and that's operated by vacuum. So at a certain vacuum it opens and lets more fuel in. Actually, I'll show you the throttle pump on my bug. If you're enjoying this video, make sure you give it a like, because it'll help the algorithm to get the video out there, and so more people can enjoy it or get useful information from it. And even if you want to share the video, that helps it even more. And it keeps me motivated to keep making these videos too. So comment and I'll get back to you. If you have any questions, I'll try my best to answer them. Or you might want to clear something up which I've got wrong. Right, so that's the accelerator pump. And if I move the throttle linkage, you can, hang on. And if I move the throttle linkage, you can see that push it there. And if you have a look down the throat of the carburetor, there's a little nozzle on the side there. When I open the throttle, see how it squirts fuel in there? That's the accelerator pump. So now the engine's got a gob full of fuel for when I start it up. This is why you see people pumping the throttle on old carburetor cars to get them going sometimes. And I don't have the chokes on this car either for cold starting. I just pump the accelerator pump a couple of times to squirt some fuel in. As you can see on my motor, I've got two of these carburetors, and each one of these carburetors has got a separate barrel. It's a twin carb, it's got two barrels. So I've got a barrel for each cylinder. The standard VW has a single barrel carburetor here which feeds all four cylinders. or you can have just one of these carbs in the middle here, so each barrel serves 2 cylinders. I don't actually know why you don't see this set up much on V8s. Like everyone puts a Holly 4 barrel in the middle, and you don't see 4 twin Webers on them that often. I think it might be an airspeed thing. There's also mid-running stages and full throttle enrichment and actual high-speed engine running, which needs to be accounted for as well. And a carburetor does all of that. Like idling, for example. With EFI, idling, the injector's pulsing fairly slowly on idle. And with the carburetor, the throttle flap's shut. But there is a little hole under it, which lets fuel through. And you can adjust this with a mixture screw, because not all engines draw the same amount of air. And you can also adjust the amount of fuel going to this screw with the different size jet, the idle jet. So this is where we get into the jetting of the carburetor. You've got jets for the idle stage, you've got jets for normal running and full throttle. And you also have jets to alter the amount of air which is going into another jet. There's also progression holes in the bottom here, so that when you open the throttle slightly, it opens up another fuel hole to suck fuel out of. All sorts of clever stuff like that. These pictures behind me are from the Haynes Weber carburetor manual, and that manual, and probably the Haynes manuals for the other carburetors, are really good at explaining the circuits on the carburetor and how they work and what the jets do and everything. So if you're into that sort of thing, I would advise looking at the Haynes manuals, and there are various ones in PDF form on the internet nowadays, so you don't have to go and buy a big copy. But for example, the idle circuit, as you can see, the throttle valve is slightly open and it's sucking air through past the mixture screw. But before it gets there, it has to go through the idle jet up the top there, and you can change the size of this jet to let more fuel through. And the progression circuit, as you can see, the throttle valve's opened a little bit more and has uncovered that other hole there to let a bit more fuel through. But also, what's very important with fuel injection and carburetors is atomization of the fuel. That's actually getting it mixed up in the air in a nice sort of even amount. Fuel injectors do that with a spray pattern, so they spray it in a nice pattern. But it's a little bit more difficult with a carburetor. So on sort of normal running and acceleration, full throttle and stuff, high speed air going through the carburetor, the air actually mixes with the fuel before it gets into the venturi as well. This is done through emulsion tubes, which are jets which mix air and fuel together. It squirts out through the middle of the carburetor there, already slightly atomized, so it's a lot more efficient. I'll show you some. So these here are the emulsion tubes, one for each barrel. So they're very easy to get to. And they've also got the main jet on the end there, and if I pull this apart there, you've got the air corrector jet, I think that's what it's called, in there, which, changing the size of this jet, if you make that bigger, it lets more air in, so it makes a mixture leaner. And that's your main jet at the bottom, that's for fuel. If you make that bigger, it makes a mixture richer. And it's got various little air holes here which help emulsify the fuel and atomize it. So that guy just pops back in there, look. And just under here, just there, can you see that? The screw there, there's another one there. They're the idle jets. And you've got your mixture screws here. And also you've got some idle adjustment air screws there as well. We won't get into that right now. So in another video, I'm going to be getting into how I jet carburetors without a dyno by driving it and testing it on the bug. So the ones I've just taken out were 115s and these are 145s. So you've hopefully now got a better understanding of how a carburetor works and you can see why I believe it's important to know how one of these works when tuning EFI. So what's better, EFI or carburetors? Well, that's for you to decide. But working with carburetors, you don't need all the equipment and computers and sensors and stuff you do when tuning EFI. But EFI is infinitely more tunable, especially when you get into things like boost and stuff like that, which produces more power. Well, who knows? But this 3,000 horsepower Camaro here has a carburetor on it. I hope you enjoyed that. I enjoyed making it, and if there's anything else I've missed or anything else you want to know, any questions, I'm happy to answer them if you comment. So make sure you like, subscribe, comment and share, and have a great day. Oh, and watch another one of my videos, maybe this one here.